Good afternoon. Let's start. Thank you for joining this last panel of a very long CPDP conference, an exciting conference. This is a Caspar Bowden panel. I will say let me say a few words about Caspar Bowden, who was a very inspiring privacy advocate and one of the most outspoken critics of government backdoor surveillance. Years before Snowden, he had already mapped the architecture of what governments and corporations were doing to our data. I must say that we at the EDPS are great admirers of his work. As a tribute to his continuous fight against mass surveillance and for the right to privacy and a free society, today this panel will discuss the CSAM regulation and its implication for encryption, privacy, and fundamental rights. The question which is at the core of this panel is how to address the problem of the spread of child sexual abuse material online and grooming without sliding into mass surveillance. To that end, we have three distinguished speakers. Bart Preneel, full professor at Leuven in Belgium, head of the research group COSIC, Computer Security and Industrial Cryptography of the Electrical Engineering Department. He's a renowned international expert in cryptography, security, and privacy-preserving technologies. We have as well Svea Windwehr, policy advisor at Mozilla. Work focuses on European digital policy, platform regulation, user rights, and countering surveillance from a variety of angles, including data retention, safeguarding, encryption, and child protection. And last but not least, we have Rand Amut, not as indicated, representative for the Commission, who in the end could not come today. But instead, we have the Director of Security, Surveillance and Human Rights Program and Regional Encryption Lead at the Center for Democracy and Technology Europe. She leads advocacy to strengthen democratic oversight of surveillance, defend encryption, and advance safeguards for privacy, equality, and the rule of law in the digital age. So before I open the floor to our panelists, let me briefly map the terrain. The starting point for everything we will discuss today is the Commission communication of July 2020, the EU strategy for a more effective fight against child sexual abuse. That document sets the reference framework for EU action to protect children against abuse for the 2020-2025 period. Its goal was to drive action from all key actors: law enforcement, social services, health professionals, educators, the judiciary, and private industry. It included 8 concrete initiatives built around 3 pillars: a more effective law enforcement response, better support for victims, and improved prevention. It was also taking stock of the rise of child sexual abuse online in the aftermath of COVID-19. Children were spending more time online unsupervised, and more demand for child sexual abuse material rise as more offenders were isolated at home. It stated that the EU had become one of the largest hosts of child sexual abuse material globally. And the strategy was also pointing out at the introduction of end-to-end encryption as a way helping offenders to hide their action from law enforcement. It thus appeared urgent to find solutions to allow companies to detect and report child sexual abuse in end-to-end encrypted communications that would allow both the privacy of electronic communication and the protection of children. But at the end of 2020, the European Electronic Communication Code extended the scope of the e-privacy directive to messaging services and webmail. It was thus necessary to ensure that providers of electronic communication services could continue their voluntary practices to detect child sexual abuse material, practices that were at risk of becoming legally untenable. An interim regulation was adopted to create a temporary and strictly limited derogation from the e-privacy directive for the sole purpose of detecting, reporting, and removing child sexual abuse material online. And that interim measure has been the backbone of voluntary CSAM detection in the EU since. Then came the substantive proposal. In May 2022, the Commission presented its proposal for regulation to prevent and combat child sexual abuse online, building on the 2011 directive and the 2020 strategy. At its heart was a mechanism that would have made detection obligation mandatory. And it is here that the political storm began. The proposal has been widely criticized for its privacy implication, in particular the imposition of obligation for online service providers to detect, report, remove, and block CSAM, which would have affected messaging services, webmail, and interactive platform. That when we started talking about the chat control initiative, critics were warned that it was incompatible with end-to-end encryption, and that scanning technology were not ready, not providing sufficient level of efficiency. Data protection authorities, civil society organizations, and several member states pushed back as mandatory detection orders would install a generalized, indiscriminate surveillance regime, undermining the secrecy of communication in a way incompatible with the essence of the fundamental rights to privacy and data protection. So the Council took over 3 years to find a common position. On 26 November 2025, under the Danish presidency, the Council finally agreed its stance, one that preserves risk assessments, risk mitigation, removal orders, oversight mechanism, and the EU Center, but excluded mandatory detection orders. Trilogue negotiation between the Council, the Parliament, and the Commission began on 9 December 2025, with substantive discussion continuing into 2026. Meanwhile, that's a long story, the clock ran out on the interim regime. On 26 of March 2026, the European Parliament rejected a proposal to extend the interim regulation, meaning that as of 3rd of April 2026, online platforms are no longer operating under any EU-level derogation that permits voluntary proactive CSAM scanning. That is in this context that this panel meets. The questions before us are urgent and unresolved. The debate seems locked. So the question I would like to ask our panelists is, what now? How do we move forward? Is there a way to reconcile interpersonal communication scanning with the right to privacy? Or should we explore alternatives, and in that case, which one? So I will first give the floor to Bart, Preneel, to reply to this question.
Thank you, and I'm a great admirer of the work of Caspar. And of course, he has much more legal expertise than I do. I always feel a bit like a tourist here because I'm just a technical expert. But I find myself more and more in Brussels because there seem to be more and more regulations with some technical issues being proposed. And we have to keep writing letters and making critical comments. So I'll do my best to give you a little bit of a technical perspective on some of the issues, and you'll get much better expertise on the legal side from my fellow panelists. Before we start, I still think I want to emphasize that we believe that CSAM is a very serious problem, and abuse of children is a terrible problem, because very often if you criticize proposals in this direction, you're often criticized as minimizing this problem, but it's a very serious problem. And of course, rather than preventing the spreading of CSAM, we would like to prevent abuse of children, which I think is actually much more important. Although, of course, spreading CSAM is also quite bad. So detection is not something new, and I want to say a few things about technology to detect, because actually we did some recent research, also stimulated in part by the legal development, on something called perceptual hash functions. I want to comfort you, there will be no formulas, only pictures. Okay, it will be very lightweight, it's Friday evening, but I just still wanted to show you a bit of our result. So more or less, if you want to detect CSAM content, at this moment, this is done still by thousands of service providers. By the way, it's also done for terrorist content already today on a very large scale, again, thousands of service providers. And there are large databases of CSAM content. And in the US, NCMEC has a large database, I think, of about 19 million images. Also, Europol has databases, the British police has databases, and there are similar databases with terrorist content. Now, What you cannot do is give these databases to all the service providers, because even possessing this database is illegal. You can also not give it to researchers. This is a limitation of our research because we don't get access. And we ask several possessors of the databases to help us, but they don't answer. They refuse to work with us because we actually found some problems in the techniques they're using. So rather than giving you those pictures, they give you what we call a hash of those pictures, like a fingerprint of the picture. It can be between about 96 bits to about 1200 bits. And so it's kind of a fingerprint that you compute from the picture, and that just gives you a series of zeros and ones. And these are being distributed among the service providers, so they can actually check whether, by taking an image that they see on their server, for example, they can also apply the same function, and then check whether it's in the database of the illegal pictures, and if so, it will be flagged. But they don't have the original picture. Now, this is kind of an easy problem. We do this, typically it's very easy. For cryptography, this is peanuts, I would say. We do this on a large scale. For example, guaranteeing integrity of code updates on your phone is done in a similar technique, that we take a fingerprint of the code and then we digitally sign the code. So this is standard technology. But the problem for pictures is that it's actually very easy to change one pixel, and then if you use a normal hash function, the fingerprint will be completely different. And there is many ways you can change pictures without changing the perception. You can change the colors a bit, you can rotate the picture a bit, you can compress it a bit. So there is many ways to edit the picture, and the goal is that in this perceptual hash function, if the perception of the picture is the same, the hash function should be the same as well. And my belief is that, in fact, this is mathematically impossible. But we still have not been able to find the proof, but what we have been able to do is find many serious problems with the functions that are used today. Some of these functions actually were made public, like Apple made neural hash public. Also, Meta made PTK public, or at the time Facebook. But for example, Microsoft uses PhotoDNA, and this is kept close secret. But of course, these close secrets find themselves on GitHub at some moment. And so we're actually the first ones to produce from the code a full mathematical description and find serious flaws. There were earlier flaws, but what I show you in the picture, how bad it really is. By the way, these functions were originally designed for copyright violations. So in that case, of course, the risk is much less. If information leaks or a mistake is being made, well, in general, copyright violations, if you detect something like this, you send a notification, you ask to remove the content, and that's it. Of course, finding terrorist content or finding CSAM is a very different thing, which means that errors are much worse. So maybe also important to know is that these functions are, like PhotoDNA is kept secret, and then when in the CSAM debate, when Microsoft or Meta come to the commission, they say, and the error rate of these functions is 1 in 10 billion, 50 billion, 1 trillion, which means more or less you will never get a mistake if you have a fingerprint that you will confuse it with a different image. Okay? So this is scientifically completely invalidated. The functions are secret. They just make this claim, and the commission repeats them in all their documents. So what we and some other researchers have shown is that those claims are completely nonsense. So what you see here is some pictures from a database of celebrities, because I cannot do research on CSAM pictures, because nobody will want to give them to me. And also if I say, can you please run our tool on your pictures, they will not answer. But so what I did is we took pictures of celebrities, and so as you see, for example, the people on the left, they actually have the same fingerprint, although they're obviously different people. The same 3 people on the right as well, we blurred them slightly, but they still have the same fingerprint. So this is 200,000 pictures, and we already have identical things. So in fact, it's not 1 in a trillion, not in 1 in 50 billion, not in 1 10 billion. It's actually several in a few 100,000. The same thing, by the way, the top is for neural hash, the bottom is for PhotoDNA. This is again the same database, and we found there also pictures with the same hash. Then another problem is that imagine that you somehow want to incriminate somebody. So you're aware of some CSAM, which you somehow get. Can you then modify a picture in such a way that, in fact, it will appear in the database, although it's an innocent picture? And what you see here is, again, example. So the picture on the left are 2 original pictures with a different imprint, and then we made small modifications, and on the right, they have the same imprint. So more or less, if you put a top picture in the database, even if you send the bottom picture, you actually will get a trigger, you see a slight degradation in quality. This is not a new result. People could do this. But in earlier research, it took several hours on a very powerful machine. This takes a few seconds on a laptop. And we haven't even optimized it because we thought it was fast enough. The other problem which we found out about photodNA, which is the most widely used function, is you have a picture. If you put a frame on the picture, then in fact the hash value will completely change and you will evade detection. So more or less, you don't need to be high-tech researcher image processing. You just put a frame around your picture and you will be able to send it and it will not appear as being part in the database. This is something we reported to Microsoft. Of course, all these results were reported to Microsoft last September, and I hope that they fixed it now, but of course we don't know because nothing is public. Or we haven't seen the new version. Here is more false negative. So again, this is for PDQ, or Meta, and photodNA. So the snake on the top is the original snake. We modify it, it will evade detection. And the same thing on the right. The snake on the left there is the original one, and you just make small modifications. The quality degrades, maybe a small white spot appears, and you will evade detection. So, and then finally, so it's also claimed that from the fingerprint you can't deduce information. So what we did is we took some original pictures, we applied the fingerprint, and then we tried to reverse it. And on the left you see it for PDQ, on the right for photodNA. The answer of Microsoft to our research was, this is very interesting, but we knew about all these problems. This is not designed for this purpose. It's not an issue. And if you go to the website today, it still says photodNA hash is not reversible and therefore cannot be used to recover an image. So now I'm not going to make an argument. You can judge for yourself what we can recover and cannot recover. And of course, again, this is in seconds. We probably can do better if we have more time. So, but I just wanted to show that the core technology for all this detection probably works reasonably well for actually copyright detection, watermarking for copyright, where you have large volumes, but problem is minor. But it actually does not work for CSAM, and all these statistics, all these claims of billions are just complete scientific nonsense. They're just been made up. And if you push with the designers, they actually, they can never provide scientific claims or evidence that it works. Of course, as a shortcut, our research does not work on CSAM because we don't have it. And we could generate it, but we can also go to jail, so I don't feel like going to jail just to prove that these functions are bad, because I think we made our point. That's more or less, that's what I wanted to show as technical part. So this is something we've been saying in our letters, that this technology is not mature, and if such kind of mistakes mean that the police will be at your door, or at your employer, will confiscate all your devices, will search your house for this kind of mistakes, it's actually dramatic. It actually has happened already, as you may know. There is 2 dads who lost their Google account because, again, mistakes of one of those hash functions that were supposed not to happen. But at this moment, this technology is used at small scale. If you're really going to deploy this everywhere at large scale, we're going to see many of those incidents. And we actually, at this moment, don't have a solution. So that, I think, is more technical contribution, and I hope it was not too technical. So now we go back to scanning. So in principle, at this moment, because there is no derogation, it's not allowed to scan, not even voluntarily. With exception, I guess, if you post things on social media, then they can do scanning, because then it's public. But as you may know, since Snowden, we use more and more end-to-end encryption. So in WhatsApp, in Signal, for a while, well, until recently also in Instagram. And then, of course, the scanning doesn't work anymore because the server does not see the image. The image is encrypted. So the proposal of the Commission in the CSAR draft was actually to do the scanning on the device, which we believe is highly intrusive. It's a bit like putting a camera in your house to check whether or not you're doing illegal things. Also, it means that if this function is on every device, this hash function will leak immediately. photodNA has remained unleaked for 6 or 8 years. But also the database will have to be on every device. So this database, which is now closely guarded, will suddenly be on every phone, which means more or less our researchers will have it in a few minutes. Again, which will result to things like inverting databases and finding false negatives and false positives a lot easier. So we don't think that even if they would decide that this should happen, that we have actually technology that is workable today. I think it's an important message that apparently nobody wants to hear. And maybe as a final statistic on research, so then there is an answer yeah, but there is some problem with false positives, but we will only report you if you have at least, say, 8 pictures of false positives. We did some analysis, for example, neural hash from Apple. More or less, if you do like the average European citizen, which is sending about or making about 400 selfies per year, it's not like me, but apparently this is average for Europe. This is a bit more than 1 per day. Then about the whole Brussels population would be reported by accident every year. So that's the kind of scale we're looking at. So like 1 million people in the EU per year. Again, these functions are not sufficiently reliable. I guess I made my point there. There is other problems, of course, with this using of fingerprints is that you get function creep. As I said, these functions are already used for terrorist content, so now the regulation is for CSAM. Very quickly, it will be extended to terrorism and then organized crime. And then, of course, there is the risk also that less democratic regimes will use it for memes critical of the government. So I think for a dictator, something like this is a dream. If you get in real time the emails and the details, the email addresses of all your citizens who have shared a particular meme that you don't like. So the same tool could actually be used for this. And this is also the reason why Apple, who first enthusiastically proposed such a construction, actually later on said, in fact, we don't think we should propose something like this. So they actually withdrew their own proposal. Also, if you look at the bigger picture, in general, the request for access to protected data, encrypted data, so it's clear that in this case, CSAM has been used as an excuse to actually get broader access to encrypted data. It's not actually, I don't think there is such a big concern, unfortunately, about the children that are abused. I think it's more like, let's use this in a bigger debate, and let's speculate on the fact that it's, as politician, very hard to go against a proposal that intends to protect the children. So you see this also in the debates you have, or the written responses from the Commission, they become very emotional, and they speak about somebody they know who was abused and so on, but if they don't speak of the broader societal risk. So I think I'll wrap up here. We can go more in detail. I can more respond to what my colleagues have to say. They'll probably have to say more about the policy aspect, but clearly also this has side effects if you would do client-side scanning, a chilling effect, and it's clearly also not proportional. Thank you.
Thank you, Bart, for pointing to us that even beyond the encryption debate, I mean, the technology might not even be ready for the scanning. It might not be useful. I will turn to Rand now. I've read that CDT argued that the forthcoming CSAM regulation is now an opportunity to protect against both the reintroduction of indiscriminate mass scanning and other mechanisms which undermine online anonymity and privacy. And that's an important opportunity to reset the direction of the trialogues. In which direction should the discussion go?
Test. Yeah, this is working. First of all, thank you so much for your question, and thank you, Bart, for that presentation. I think it was incredibly important for me as well to see firsthand how difficult this kind of technology is applicable, or perhaps not mature enough. And also thank you to everyone who's still courageous enough to stay on this Friday afternoon. Actually, I will take this opportunity perhaps to talk about the current direction of travel, where we're heading, and some stakes that are still left, especially on detection, as we are on here right now. So first of all, perhaps I'd like to also recognize the fact that we are at a kind of different place than where we started 6 years ago. I would say a better place in terms of moving away from encryption being in scope and client-side scanning. However, with detection, we still risk mass scanning with the current direction of travel, while the expiration of the derogation was, I would say, a good win for privacy. Currently, what is being negotiated is detection orders that also cover services or layers of services. So, for example, a complete message function being under the scope of detection orders, which is in another language or another form of saying mass detection, because there is no way that a complete function being under scanning is in any way proportionate or necessary. what we're saying at CDT Europe is that if there is any detection that remains within the CSAM regulation, that it would be, first of all, we should move towards the detection warrants language. Therefore, any detection order should follow strict lawful standards of lawful warrants, therefore be time and purpose limited, which therefore means that it cannot be to include an entirety of a service or the individuals using a service, but rather be very specific to a user under suspicious grounds, under reasonable suspicious grounds, or a group of users or devices that are therefore linked to suspicious activity. But even with that, and with what Bart just presented us with, there is still quite questionable, quite a lot of questions around how much that can be effective and impactful on publicly hosted content, but let alone on private messaging. So currently, that is still a huge risk. While we've moved away from the original incredibly problematic model, we're still within the risks of having a model that does still allow detection, but making it look like mass detection, but making it look a bit less problematic by saying it is on a very specific service or layer of service, which is also very much incompatible with the DSA, no general monitoring principles. More issues stay within, I would say, the threat of possibilities that are currently undergoing in the negotiations for the CSAM, including what we are calling for, which is sticking to verified material, despite already existing issues with that, but not also including new material or grooming material because of the context-heavy analysis that would need to happen in order to confirm whether that material is indeed CSAM or not. And what currently is perhaps being addressed or discussed is including handbooks within the definition of CSAM, which doesn't look as problematic until we understand that it does follow the same issue as any text analysis. It would require more text analysis and therefore requires more context analysis, and therefore means that it would open up ground for further surveillance and further detection of text, which is very problematic in itself. So sticking to verified audiovisual material would be important in order to limit the scope as much as possible. The other issues that still come up within the current direction of travel is the risk mitigation issues that need to be taken. With that, we see quite a lot of conversation around age verification, which is also still something that is very premature, but that didn't stop the Commission from launching a whole app that was then hacked in 2 minutes, and it honestly left us all with more questions than answers around how can we ensure that this application is indeed providing with the necessary cybersecurity elements for the individuals using it, not only children, because it won't be only children who's using it, it will be all of us, but that would include individuals in exile, journalists, individuals who need to use the internet in anonymity, which is the right for everyone, and that still isn't fully addressed, but it's meant to be happening within, or is suggested to be happening within the risk mitigation actions within the CSAM. Currently, we are only aware that there will be, the final trialogues in June, but it seems that quite a lot of conversations haven't happened yet, including on detection. There is no consensus on what detection should entail, if it should indeed entail only public environments, or if it will entail interpersonal communications, even if encryption is out of scope, so not including communications that are encrypted. But also the text analysis is quite under risk at this stage as well. So I will leave it here because I think that we will have a lot of questions on this, and also I want to leave some space for Svea's intervention. And I will pass it back to you.
Thank you very much. You mentioned a serious topic, age verification debate, for instance, which we'll see how it evolves for the moment. But first I want to give the floor to... That's okay. To Svea, about maybe to talk about maybe possible alternatives that we should explore, or how we can open the debate building maybe on what Rand has just explained to us.
Sure. Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. And so Rand and Bart just laid out the technical and the policy challenges really well. And I know you asked about better ways forward, but I think in order to get there, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what has got us here, right? Like, what are the factors that make it so hard to move forward in this debate? And I think there's like three main things to me. So one is, the first one connects very well with what Bart has been describing. There is this magical thinking around technological solutions to an incredibly complex societal problem, right? At this point, we know a lot about child sexual abuse. We know, for example, that abuse often and mainly happens in the societal close environment of a child. So in school, in their wherever they do sports, where they spend their free time and family. It is not actually strangers. It is usually people they know. The same thing for grooming. I think we all have this idea of like stranger danger and like strangers grooming people online. That is actually not the case. We are the most typical patterns of grooming that have been established by researchers and people working on child safety is that it's actually people the child already knows, and it's usually there's usually an element of vulnerability of that child's situation. So there might be conflict at home, there might be parents separating, there might be depression, anxiety, and then someone the child already knows essentially takes advantage of that and then starts grooming and builds that relationship to eventually exploit and abuse the child. So there is a lot of knowledge, I think, especially from the child rights and child protection community, which is astonishingly not represented in these policy discussions at all. Instead, there is this commitment to techno-solutionism, essentially, and the assumption that this very, very complex issue can be flattened into a question of scanning and detection. That brings me to the second factor, which I think is fascinating, that in a regulation on child sexual abuse, the sole focus of this regulation is detection. There is nothing in that piece of law around prevention of child sexual abuse or the support of survivors and people going through this, which I think is absolutely astonishing, because this is if done well, a once-in-a-generational opportunity to actually improve the situation and to put structures in place to support children and the people caring for them. So again, I think we need to really move beyond this focus of detection of material to really essentially get to a point where we can think about how do we prevent the creation of material, the abuse of children in the first place. And the third element that I think has been really critical in this debate is that somehow we have let the political discourse around this be captured by this false dichotomy of privacy and safety. So we have somehow let policymakers convince us that privacy and safety are at odds with each other. And I think in this room, this is not a surprise, but I think there is, it's been established that privacy is not just any fundamental right, it's like a primus inter pares right. So privacy enables us to do things, it affords us to enjoy other fundamental rights, like the freedom of expression, like the free development of our identity, of our sexuality, of our relationships. It's a core fundamental element of liberal and democratic societies to allow people to participate. So privacy obviously has to be a core component of safety for many people, and especially for young people, for vulnerable people, and for survivors of child sexual abuse or any kind of sexual abuse. So I think these kind of elements are a big reason as to why it is so hard, or it has been so hard to move forward and to move beyond this incredibly entrenched and politicized and emotional debate around the child sexual abuse regulation proposal by the European Commission. But I am really hoping that either miraculously during the last couple of meters of trilogues or whenever we can put this chapter behind us, we can finally move to a place where we can actually work on supporting and building structures that protect children, that prevent abuse, and that strengthen the societal fabric that essentially helps us to take care of children in vulnerable positions. Just one last sentence on the scanning, because I think it is kind of fascinating. So as Bart mentioned, there is no legal basis currently for scanning. Still, major technology companies have come out and say that they do continue to scan. So there is also, I think, a fundamental disregard for the privacy of users. And I think that is also a larger trend that we see manifesting, for example, in Meta rolling back end-to-end encryption on Instagram, of TikTok committing to never encrypt DMs on TikTok. So I think there is also like this broader societal political push to essentially disregard user privacy and attack encryption from that angle. And I think that is like the broader societal theme that I'm really concerned that we're essentially teaching a whole generation at the moment that it is okay to be essentially expected to be surveilled online, and the privacy is not something that we can expect anymore. So I think in order to move forward, I know this was not very productive at all, but I think these are the sort of the conversations we need to have, which are harder and more uncomfortable than focusing on a technological fix.
Thank you very much. I think you're challenging a bit the assumption on which the debate has been evolving so far, which I found maybe that's the way forward, no? That you are the message to think about maybe different aspects of the problem. Much of the debate has been polarized on scanning, and maybe there are other areas to explore. Yesterday there was a panel on this topic beyond encryption, with an example, for instance, from Northern Ireland, where they really worked on improving the criminal proceedings, the training to policemen, the support to the children, the prevention as well. And they were already saying that they could see a lot of improvement. So I think we all agree that this debate is multifaceted, I would say, and we have to maybe take a bigger picture, take the bigger view on the problem in order to the solution might come from a different path. I don't know if you would like to react to add on what all the panelists have said. If you want to add something.
So maybe also looking at the future, I only limited myself to detecting of known content, but of course there is new content and AI will actually make it a lot easier. So in any case, this effort that's being created in detecting known content will become futile. So I guess this is more like how to control AI. And in short term, I'm kind of optimistic. You can probably get collaboration of the big models to not do certain things. But in the long run, I think these models will run on our desktops, and people will train them themselves. So I see a very big concern. And then the question is, there's also a bit of hope you saw in the early drafts that AI is then going to detect all of this. And I guess AI can do some things, but there is one concern is, of course, the computational cost, because we do send billions of videos and pictures, and applying a hash function takes something like 10 microseconds or so, but doing an AI analysis of a video or an image is quite expensive. And also the other thing is, of course, that typically you can't recognize the context, right? This is the same problem of this dad sending a picture of his son with a skin disease to the doctor. The AI will also not know the context unless we give all our secrets to the AI. And if you have this kind of vision where you have your personal agent who knows everything about you and can tell to big tech that you're a good person, but that's not the kind of world I want to live, where you have to give all your data to prove that you're actually a good person, that you can actually do things you want to do in your life. So I think this debate will intersect with AI debate, and I'm not sure it's going to be a very friendly marriage. I see very big concerns, but I think we have to prepare for it because it's going to be the next debate. And I think so initially to justify CSAR, there was a growing number of detected known images that was used as argument. And I guess we're going to see the same thing to justify introducing AI there, because there will be a growing number of AI-generated images. Maybe you should also say something good. At least the council text, the compromise from last fall, at least had a bit more emphasis in respect of making it easy to report things. I mean, I'm not a very intensive user of social media, and I don't get pictures like this sent to me, but what I hear is that if you report something like this, very often nothing happens, or a very slow response, or it takes a long time to get things removed. And I had the impression, at least, that the CSAR text increases pressure, but I guess in general we cannot enough increase the pressure that at least if users complain that there should be a quick response. And of course this is expensive, because it means you have to have people available 24/7 and who can look at the context, and not just an AI that decides, oh, this is a justified complaint or not. And I guess it's expensive, and so it will only happen if there is enough legal pressure.
Maybe just to pick up on that, I think it's an interesting element, and also something that I find a little bit cynical about this debate, because the Digital Services Act has mandated reporting mechanisms and is fully in force since February 2024. So there's absolutely no need for a separate reporting mechanism. Child sexual abuse material is illegal in every European country, and this is already covered by the DSA. So I think there are also tools available that we could be making use of. Yeah, period. And maybe just one thing to something that you mentioned, Fanny, just as an example. So last fall, as the German government was debating its position on the council mandate, and there was a big push in Germany to essentially secure the protection of encryption because it looked like the German government might fall, and we all know what that does to European majorities. At the same time, the only project in Germany that works with perpetrators, so people who have self-reported to have either consumed or even created child sexual abuse material, and who want to essentially make sure that they do not re-offend, the funding for that project was cut. And I think that is such a good example of the double morale in this context, because there is so little commitment to actually spending the resources to help the people who are affected by this, depending on either side of the phenomenon. And I really wish there was just, I think, a little bit more political honesty around the goals behind this approach.
Maybe to add to what my wonderful co-panelists have already said, I would agree with Bart that this conversation is also, not happening in isolation. And it's quite contradictory to many of the principles that policymakers are claiming to want and push for at the moment. So on one hand, the conversation around sovereignty is huge, but on the other hand, you're allowing big tech organizations to scan everyone's communications, or leaving it in a kind of a gray zone and not really thinking about what's going to happen. On one hand, you want to equip law enforcement with more shiny technologies in order to help them do their jobs, but on the other hand, you have very little oversight on what ends up happening with these technologies. We've seen this with different technologies, slightly different topic, but we've seen this with spyware, for example, where we see abuse of use of spyware from law enforcement against individuals that have, journalists, human rights defenders, etc. And we don't have actually any transparency on when this technology was actually used to catch actual criminals or to catch actual criminal activity. So then you have this dichotomy of wanting to solve very serious societal issues and problems, but only addressing them from a very limited and very not creative point of view of just throwing more technology at it, while leaving the issues at hand very much unaddressed, as Svea was saying, but also the way forward is really, first of all, enforcing what already exists under the DSA and other legal frameworks, but also making sure that what needs to be resourced is actually resourced. So a lot of money is going to defense and law enforcement, but not really to help in effective investigations, and not really to help the units that have to deal with sifting through all this content and wondering what is CSAM and what isn't CSAM, and where to go and how to catch the individuals, and looking at effective and less intrusive methods of doing so. And it's not a very optimistic way to end this Friday afternoon conversation, but it's where we are.
I was wondering after what Bart explained with the AI generated content, will this change actually the nature of the problem? Because we can anticipate an explosion of CSAM, I would say, and how can we deal with it? Because that was already the concern in 2020, the rise of material, and here with the use of AI, this problem will just be, it seems, unmanageable from what you're saying.
Yes, for sure. So we don't know the exact numbers, but NECMEC says a few years ago 17 to 18 million pictures of known. I think the UK, I heard something like 40 or 50. So I think we can probably safely assume that at this moment there is less than 100 million pictures, which of course gives you a certain number of false positives. The more pictures in the database, the more risk for false positives if you're going to scan anybody's pictures or if you're going to search. But of course with AI, this can increase very quickly. And of course, you can detect them or they can be reported and uploaded to the database, but then the database will keep growing. And then you get all these false positives increasing. So it seems to be a negative feedback loop where the problem is already very hard and the problem will become harder. And again, so the answer which was in the first draft of the regulation was we'll use AI to do this. But there is no credible approach. I mean, the company pushing this ID, they say we have a false positive rate of 10%. Excuse me, that's like, 300 million reports per day in the EU. I mean, what are you going to do with this? So it's clear that it's very hard. And as I said, also, it's computationally intensive. It's not going to be low cost to do this. So I'm kind of concerned about this. I still think it means that this detection approach is not going to work. And you'll have to go at the prevention, go at the infiltration techniques. I think it's play at all the other levels because detection will become hopeless. And I think apparently this is kind of head in the sand. We're not going to admit that. But for now, I believe we can control the models, right? I mean, Grok is kind of misbehaving and then you can punish them and probably block it. But what if you have a model running on your laptop doing it? What are you going to do then? And I think saying today, oh, it's not going to happen, I think that's very naive. I think you speed at what things go ahead. And I'm not an expert in this area, but I think it would be surprising if it cannot be done in 3 to 5 years, that you train your own model locally and it does everything you want. And it's an open model, so you can do what you want. And it's enough that you have a limited number of pictures and you will train it to make more. And that's a bit of a doom scenario, but I guess it means that we have to actually invest more in the other things.
You want to add something? Yeah, to add to Bart's point, I mean, it also raises the question of the integrity of all investigations, even those that are quite legitimate, because, I mean, what are you going to do and say when you have mass scanning using technology that's quite unreliable and produces quite a lot of false positives? What can you say then of the integrity of the evidence that is produced or the traceability of it, which inherently makes all investigations, even ones that are based on legitimate, and that have exhausted so many resources, questionable then. So then it kind of turns the table on, okay, wanting to, there is a very clear moral value as to why we all want to fight CSAM, but then we inherently damage investigations that are legitimate then if we rely on these technologies.
Thank you. If you have, I will maybe open the floor for questions.
Hi, Kirsten Nelson de Borca, working for Mozilla. I might ask two, unless you want to interrupt me, but I'm going to start with one. Both questions refer to kind of looking to where there's actually resources to deal with these problems. One thing I'll say is maybe more of a comment that if you want to share any reflections on, feel free to, and then the latter I'll explain in a moment. Earlier this week, I should acknowledge my former employer laid off a ton of employees focusing on issues like this from, trust and safety operational perspectives. So a ton of internal people who would have handled escalations, law enforcement requests, all of these types of things. And it really makes me wonder as to whether this is just apparent disregard for existing regulation and kind of, shrugging and going, well, the fine amounts don't really matter that much, enforcement not having sufficient teeth to actually dissuade them from doing things like this. So that's what actually I'm going to ask both because maybe they're kind of related. The other thing from a resourcing perspective is you were commenting as a group collectively a lot on the reduction of commitment of resources financially from, I guess, like a government perspective. Generally, these companies have a lot of money, so I guess the question is whether any of you have any thoughts on how they could commit their own resources, because there are a ton of experts that they have in-house who go about coming up with processes to make sure this type of information or imagery isn't shared publicly already. So I know it's their black box and they own it, but yeah, it just seems a little bit, I don't know, it's a very hard thing to do, of course, but it just seems like that would be a good conversation to force. I assume it's already been forced before and that the answers are nuanced and hard, so asking for context on that. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Who wants to take the question?
Maybe I can say something on tech companies' resources. As someone who used to work at a tech company and used to work also on child sexual abuse there. So I do think that a lot of tech companies, especially large ones, especially those that develop their own tools, are extremely serious about detection. I think this is something a lot of people internally care greatly about. And I think for a good reason, right? Like, I think it is also something compelling. If you do have matches and you report them to NECMEC, I think there is a compelling reason to continue doing that. And there is a lot of industry collaboration, like around tools, best practices, how to also lighten the load on human moderators and have to review this content before it is shared. So I think there is a lot of collaboration. I think what is missing is a more systemic approach to understanding risks of services and taking action to mitigate those risks that would hurt the companies themselves. So for example, on AI issue, it is not a coincidence that models are able to generate this kind of content in the first place, or they are able to generate content notifying women, gender-based violence, etc. This is due to the scaled model of AI training of large language models that we have come to accept, apparently, where essentially as you scale a model, you need more data, more compute, but also more data, which means that essentially you'll end up scanning the entire internet, and that will include horrific material that is then used to train that model. So I think that like those kinds of commitments, I think we haven't seen yet, like companies taking structural measures to reduce the risk, offer better services. Same thing on, for example, I mean, now I think there have been some changes on Facebook, on Instagram, but for example, limiting what children's accounts are exposed to in terms of who can connect to them, like what kind of content is shown to them. And of course, companies have a very good understanding of how old the users are, even without legal age verification mandates. So I think those kind of things we haven't seen as much, like essentially like structural changes, addressing risks offered by the service themselves that would potentially diminish the ad revenue of those services.
Yeah, I fully agree with that assessment. And I think indeed what we see, we haven't discussed it or briefly, that if you look at again the council, they actually added age verification, age assessment to CSAR, yet another path where it will be done. And again, you shift the problem to technology that I think will not be mature. We've seen Australia and UK, it doesn't work very well. We've also seen the model app doesn't work very well. So, but again, I think the big platforms know the age of their users, or at least they have a good indication. So they could also ban them, or they could adjust the content. But of course, they don't want to be liable. And so you see the response is then we're going to let every citizen prove their age. Which I think, as we looked how it worked out in the UK, for example, not very well. It's actually, I think it will be a very big problem. And there, I must admit that also the community is divided. Like some cryptographers think, oh, we have very cool zero knowledge proofs where you only prove your age and you show nothing, so this must be great. But they don't look, for example, at people who will be excluded because they don't have a smartphone or because they're refugees or trans migrants. And so a large part of the population will actually be excluded from part of the social media, which they still use intensively. And so I think, indeed, for the problems with children, we should focus on the platforms and regulate that they do it in a decent way, without, of course, encouraging mass surveillance and encouraging that they take the iris pictures of children and whatever, the kind of, I guess they should not use age assessment, I think. They should use the tools they have anyway. They have, in all their advertising targeting, they know how to target advertising to children. Otherwise, they wouldn't have them as customers, right? They cost them money, and they must also bring them money. And of course, very valuable customers because they will still spend a lot of money in the rest of their lives. So, but I think we should also make them responsible to actually show them the appropriate content and protect them in an adequate way. I think it can be done. How to do it legally, I mean, that's something you should ask the legal experts.
Thank you. Any other question?
Thank you. Gloria González Fuster, just out of curiosity, now you said very politely the community is divided on this age verification. Can you tell us your opinion more elaborate on this?
Well, I think it's more or less that it's also connected to the wallet, right? The big difference between age verification and the wallet is that the Commission has always promised that the wallet would be optional. That's something that was, I think, the NGOs found it very important, again, for this reason of exclusion, that you don't want to exclude part of the population who don't have a smartphone or who don't have ways to get government ID in an acceptable way on their phone. But so even the wallet, there is designs to have zero knowledge. In zero knowledge, more or less, this is a concept from anonymous credentials, from Schaum from the early 90s, where you actually prove only what you need to prove. So you can prove, for example, you're a citizen of Brussels and you're older than 14 or 13 or whatever, and maybe other attributes. And you can prove you don't leak more information. And this is actually, of course, very cool. It's being used by cryptocurrencies. That was the first large-scale application. By the way, also by the TPM chip. So it has been rolled out in some places. But of course, there is nice features in the wallet or the Age app because you now also want to link it to a phone, which is still an interesting research problem. You want to make it post-quantum secure. So actually, there's lots of fascinating research, and people have cool schemes, and so they kind of are enthusiastic because they can make a scheme, a math scheme, and then get it adopted by 350 million users, right? And if you then tell them, as more from a privacy perspective, do you understand that even if it's privacy friendly, it will actually be privacy washing, it will exclude part of society, it actually will create control, you will increase dependence on big tech, then they get actually very upset with you, right? You take away their baby, I do understand this. And so this is why some of the community, is not the whole community, but some of the community are saying like, I'm angry that we criticize these zero knowledge proofs. Of course, we think the proofs are good for certain applications, but not for age verification. And then there is the other part of the community, which is more like, I would say, parents with children, and they feel that they have a busy life and that they don't always know what their children are doing. And they feel a bit guilty, I guess. I don't know, I'm not a psychologist. And then they want actually somebody else to solve that problem, that in fact they find out their kids are on social media and do things that they don't want to see. And then they feel that they don't have the time and the resources because they're sitting at conferences here till 6 in the evening. In the meantime, their kids are on social media and they do things. And so then they feel, well, let the government solve it and let's ban it, right? And more or less, of course, we know from Australia, there I think more than half the kids are still online, even since September there is a ban. We know also that some parents help their children to actually get online. We know about VPNs can be used, and then we hear the Commission saying we're going to ban VPNs. So more or less, the answer to this technology will be to build the great firewall of the EU. And this is something where then technologists and privacy activists are very worried about. So it starts, of course, with good intentions, and I do understand the good intentions there. I still think the solution is to make social media less addictive and toxic. That's what we should do, because it's also damaging to adults. But of course, that's, again, a question for which, as a technologist, I cannot do anything about.
Thank you. I think we're entering into an entirely new topic, but the issue, underlying issue is the same, that maybe we should address the cause, the root cause, rather than the consequences. Yeah? Any other question from the audience? So maybe because it's Friday afternoon, I can give you like 1 minute to conclude, to have some words of conclusion, and we can close this panel.
I'll start. Thank you so much, Fanny, for hosting this. Yeah, I think really, and I love that we briefly spoke about age verification, because I think really it is the exact same issue. Technology is being paraded as a solution to a really, really complex problem that would take much more resources and political commitment to resolve. And I really hope that sometime this mandate, this year, next couple of weeks, as soon as possible, we can make that shift towards commitment to actual structural solutions that address the roots of the issue and not the outcomes, and punish those most affected.
I mean, I don't have much to add, but I thank my co-panelists for all the great points they made. I think what we need at this stage, which is I think the most difficult, I will end this Friday with a very difficult ask, which is political and technical honesty about the solutions and the suggested solutions that are being discussed at policymaker level, because I think after this panel and after the many panels at CPDP on this topic, we can all sort of come to an agreement that what is being proposed doesn't really come to the root cause of the issue, but rather creates more problems than it actually solves and puts strain on resources that are already quite strained, which is why effective investigations are not happening in the first place. So to go back to the boardroom and think effectively and honestly about what we want.
I mean, to end on a positive note, cryptographers can do magic for you. We can do really magic things, like protecting communications end-to-end, and hiding your IP address, and proving things without leaking things. So we can actually do really cool things that are very needed. Of course, it takes time to develop these things. You should not rush and think about it for a while. But that doesn't mean that all these things should be used, and some of these technologies should not be used. And also there are things which we cannot do, like I gave you example of perceptual hashing. My gut feeling is we cannot do that. So you should be very careful with when you listen to technologists, sometimes there's things we can do, sometimes we cannot do, but we can also do many positive things just to end on a positive note. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for participating in this panel, for this great discussion. I hope this contributed a bit to the debate that is coming and continuing.